All right, thanks for your patience, everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get the show started. If anyone was coming down Mopac like I was earlier, it was a little bit crazy today for being summer. It's supposed to be no traffic, but with all the construction, obviously, who knows, all bets are kind of off right now. So thanks for coming out, appreciate it. By show of hands, how many people, this is your first time at the meetup? Well, actually, how many have come before then? Okay, cool. So a few people, but most people are new. Great. Well, so just so you know, you may or may not have read the whole meetup description, but this meetup is called Bleeding Edge Web because myself and my co-organizer, who's not here tonight, we're both web app developers, and we typically like to talk about stuff that's generally of interest to web app developers like us. So we don't focus on any one particular framework or language, which, you know, there's typically a meetup out there for your language of choice. So we're not trying to replace that. We just like to do every month something a little bit different, but something that we think would be interesting to that kind of group. So that's what we're all about. And usually either myself or Corey will give the opening segment, which we call News from the Bleeding Edge. So you'll see what that's all about. But typically we talk about latest news with browsers or with web standards, with JavaScript, any of that kind of stuff. And then normally we'll have a deep dive talk. This month we're changing it up a little bit and we're having some lightning talks. So we have 3 people who signed up ahead of time. And if anyone else is interested or if you get inspired by the other people who get up, want to talk about something, anyone is welcome. You don't have to have anything prepared. You know, if you just happen to be working on an open source project, that's cool. If you're working on using some framework with your job, that's cool. Anything like that, that would be of interest to people. You know, feel free to jump up and talk about that. So thank you to our sponsors. Capital Factory obviously gives us this space. We really appreciate that. And this month we have Docket Navigator, which is a local company here in town that they build software tools for attorneys. So it's kind of like research tools. I think a lot of it's focused on patent research and that kind of stuff, but I don't know the details of it. Do you want to say anything, Daryl? Or?
Not you. You covered it well.
So if anyone is at all interested in legal software, patent research software, anything like that, Daryl here is your man to talk to. But other than that, thanks for the pizza. We really appreciate that. Okay, let's jump right into it. So we normally start off each month and we talk about whatever's going on with browsers. As web app developers, that's typically kind of the foundation of our platform, so it's pretty important to know what's going on with browsers. Last month, when we last checked, these were the versions. Microsoft Edge is now officially a browser on our slide, so that's new. And typically, I like to make a little trivia game out of it to see who's keeping up with this, but it was actually a super boring month for browser updates, so I'll spare you that. I think it's the first time in history this has ever happened that Opera is the only browser that had a major version update, which is kind of weird. So it's really just a timing thing. Chrome and Firefox, as most of you probably know, they're evergreen. They're updating on like a 4 to 6 week cycle. So we just kind of caught them a week or 2 before their next major releases. So version 44 of Chrome is actually going to come out pretty soon. And it has some stuff that I've listed there, but we'll talk about that. We usually, you know, obviously you could spend all day talking about all the dev features and things that are coming out, but we typically stick to what's out in the most recent stable versions. Same thing for Firefox. They've actually been working quite a bit on their dev tools, and that's something we've talked about before, and we'll probably talk about it in more detail next month, because the current and the version 40 actually the next version of their dev tools coming out have really cool stuff in them. So if you do a lot of debugging, performance debugging in particular, you might actually take a look at kind of the upcoming and the dev versions of Firefox, because they have some really cool stuff coming out. But we'll talk about that more next month. So Opera actually had a major version release, and it was somewhat interesting. As most of you, I don't know how many you do or don't know. Actually, by show of hands, how many of you would call yourself like a web app developer? You work in the browser a lot with JavaScript, maybe. Are there any non-technical people? Okay, so mostly developers at least, may or may not focus a lot on web stuff. So Opera came out with support for media source extensions, which is actually a pretty interesting spec because that is all about enabling support for video and media streaming in browsers. And that's actually pretty interesting because that'll enable support for things, for example, on a live stream, like the live stream that maybe people are watching right now, giving people media controls where they could scrub backwards and forwards in a live stream feed. So stuff like that is potentially pretty interesting. This upgrade insecure requests content security protocol directive is also kind of useful. A lot of you have probably seen sometimes when you go to web pages where the main URL is secure, HTTPS, but maybe it loads images from some domain that's not secure. And you get these pop-up warnings a lot of times depending on your browser, and it can be kind of annoying. And so this is a way for you as a developer to be able to essentially programmatically upgrade all of your content to avoid those kinds of warnings. So that's kind of a useful thing. And then JavaScript-based copy and cut, which is something that a lot of developers have wanted for years and years and years. So hopefully that'll make it into all the other browsers. And Microsoft Edge is still in preview, but it's slated to be finalized along with Windows next month. They've added a couple of things. The source set attribute is actually pretty interesting, and we've talked about it in this meetup before because that's for supporting responsive images, and that's a really useful feature, especially on mobile, for example, to be able to load different versions of images depending on the platform that you're on. So, for example, to be able to load a Retina image if you're on a laptop, or load a low-res image if you're on a mobile device, and being able to do that from the same image tag. So that's what that's all about. And of course, I keep this slide every month. I don't know why, but Safari and IE 11. Safari 9 actually will be coming out soon, though. So to be fair to Safari, their next version, what's it called? Is it Capitan? Is that what they call it? I can't remember.
Capitan.
El Capitan. Yeah, when that comes out, that'll include Safari 9, so that'll give us something more to talk about with Safari. But IE 11, of course, is pretty much, it'll be around for a while in terms of, having to support it if you're unlucky enough to have to support that. But in terms of new features and stuff, obviously, there's not going to be much to talk about. Okay, so ES6 Harmony is one of the main things I wanted to talk about this month, because as you may or may not know, the ECMAScript 6, otherwise known as JavaScript, specification after many years has actually been officially finalized and ratified. So that's a big milestone for web app developers, especially if you do a lot of JavaScript. Also, part of this meetup, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is all about mixing it up a little bit, sharing kind of general, knowledge that you guys may not have. As I was Googling for images for Harmony to have a background image for this slide, I kept running across all these My Little Ponies. So I thought, what is up with that? So it actually makes kind of a pretty background image. So I did a little research for you guys, just so you would know, that the elements of Harmony are actually the 6 supernatural artifacts representing all the aspects of Harmony. And I won't go into the details of each individual one, but as this actually comes from a wiki article, and it's linked right here so you guys can research it yourselves. But these are arguably the most powerful force in all of Equestria. So I have a 6-year-old daughter, so that is actually really useful information to me. So that was just a sort of a tangent there. So ES6 is final, and that's actually big news. ES5, which has been pretty much the de facto JavaScript since 2009, and then even then, it took a couple of years for all the browsers to really fully implement it. But at least for the last 3 or 4 years, it's been ES5. And since 2011, officially, browser vendors have been working on ES6, which is the next, the latest and greatest version of JavaScript. So it's been feature frozen since last year, and finally, as of, what is that, a couple of days ago? I don't know my date, what the date is today, but just within the last week, it's been officially published, 6th edition. So that's awesome. And there's a great intro. We've actually talked about ES6 before, like a couple of meetups ago. We went into a lot of these details, so I'm not going to do that today. But I linked to this GitHub repo that if you need a refresher on what's involved, this is actually a really great introduction to all the different features, the main features of ES6, and then each section has code examples and kind of explains what they're all about. So that's recommended if you, like I said, just need a little refresher on what that's all about. Now, another trivia question. What does ECMA stand for? Does anyone know? I know at least one person has these slides, so don't cheat and look ahead. But I found this very interesting because ECMA script is the same thing as, well, I'll talk about it on the next slide. It's basically the same thing as JavaScript. And as a JavaScript developer, I use JavaScript every day for my job. And it occurred to me as I was putting these slides together that I actually didn't even know, when you say ECMA script, I didn't even know what ECMA, what it was. Do any of you guys know? Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. It's the European Computer Manufacturers Association, which has actually been around since 1961. So it's like an old school thing. It started off back in the days of like IBM, those kinds of companies, doing physical computer hardware manufacturing, magnetic tape manufacturing. And basically back in the 60s, they kind of got together and said, hey, you know what? All these companies are building all this hardware and building all these tape formats and all this crazy stuff. We got to be able to talk to each other, right? It's the same perennial problem we have in this industry, right? So they decided to get together to standardize things. And of course, software kind of fell under that umbrella as well. So I just found that interesting. I didn't realize that it went back that far. Netscape invented JavaScript, Brendan Eich at Netscape, and then they turned it over for standardization in the early 90s, mid-90s. And ECMAScript, the very first edition of it was actually published in 97. So I was also interested in that name, ECMAScript, and it always confused me a little bit of like, well, we talk about JavaScript, right? No one would call themselves an ECMAScript developer. So where does this name come from? And turns out it's pretty boring, actually. It was really just sort of a political compromise. So Netscape, of course, had JavaScript. Microsoft, for trademark reasons, didn't use JavaScript when they came out with what essentially was JavaScript in IE, but they called it JScript. And apparently it was a big argument and they couldn't agree on anything, so they said, okay, well, ECMA is formalizing the standard, so we'll just stick with ECMAScript. And you can see at the bottom there what Brendan Eich thought about that. So the basic difference is ECMAScript is the standard, and then JavaScript is the implementation of that standard. And in any given browser or runtime environment, the implementation of JavaScript could be a little bit different, but ECMAScript, the standard, is the same. There's only one ECMAScript, so that's the difference. As far as browser support, this is really, we talk about this when we talk about ES6, because at the end of the day, standards are wonderful and we need them, and specs are wonderful, but at the end of the day, to us in this room, what really matters is what is implemented in browsers, right? And what features are available to us in the environments that we work in. So this is, by comparison, this compatibility table is for ES5. This is the version that's been around since 2009. And as you can see, for all practical purposes, it's fully supported across all the browsers that matter. Even IE, since version 9, has fully supported ES5. So that's great. ES6, little different story. It's not to be unexpected because obviously, well, it's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was just ratified, so you would maybe expect it to be not fully implemented. But on the other hand, it's been in the process of being kind of finalized for several years now. So in a way, it's a little disappointing maybe that some of the browsers aren't farther along. But it is what it is. And there's actually, also to be fair, ES5 was a fairly modest version of the spec compared to ES6. ES6 was a really major step forward for JavaScript, and there were a lot of features in it. So that's also part of the reason, a lot higher complexity for the vendors to implement it, basically. So they're all in the middle of doing that. Firefox 40 is in the lead. Firefox, it kind of stems from their history, being part of Mozilla, and originally Mozilla kind of coming out of Netscape, right? That whole lineage. So I think they still feel some obligation to sort of be on the forefront of that. Amazingly, Edge is in second place as far as ES6 support. So, whatever happened behind the scenes in Microsoft, those guys got serious about web standards and modern browser stuff. So as bad as IE is and pretty much will remain, Edge is actually looking really, really awesome. Chrome and Opera, pretty much 45%. And then Safari, unfortunately, has really bad ES6 support. So it'll be interesting to see what is going to come out in Safari 9. The good thing is, Apple does a pretty good job of upgrading their users to the latest and greatest environments. But the bad thing is, there's a lot of people on this environment, right? There's a lot of people using Safari. And so that's kind of bad for us. So we'll kind of have to keep our eyes on that. There is good news, though. So with all that red, that sea of red that we see in that table, the column that's highlighted is mostly green. That is a library called Babel, and that's what's called a polyfill library. If you're not familiar with that term, a polyfill is basically any library that fills in and provides implementations for features that are not available in whatever the platform is that it's polyfilling for, if that makes sense. So if you're on a browser that doesn't have a specific feature of ES6, like say modules, the module syntax, then Babel will polyfill that for you and provide that implementation for you seamlessly so that when you write code that uses that syntax, it'll be available to you in that browser. And Babel covers, as of today, 71% of the ES6 syntax. So that's really pretty awesome. And it's worth looking at. This is actually a really cool, it's a cool library and it's a cool site. So they call it a JavaScript compiler. I would say it's really a transpiler. It's a subtle difference, but basically a transpiler is just a tool that transpiles from one language to another, as opposed to a compiler, which is typically, you think of that more as kind of a binary, compiling to binary or whatever. But the point is, you can write code in ES6 format, so you can take advantage of JavaScript classes, the module pattern, all of the arrow functions, and all the cool stuff that's in ES6, and you can write your code just like that, and then it does add a compile step, which is negative to some people, but it'll output perfectly valid ES5 code for all the things that Babel supports. And so the output code is what actually runs in the browser, and that is actually just ES5 code. So, but it's really cool because it allows you to write code in ES6 and take advantage of all that new stuff. And this site, we've looked at it before, but this site also has a little REPL, what they call a little executable, real-time executable code console thing that you can play with. So definitely, again, if you're interested in ES6 at all, you definitely owe it to yourself to check that out. And finally, there are a fair number of resources out there about ES6, but this is one of the best ones. This guy, Axel Rauschmeier, he's a big-time guy in the JavaScript community, and he's putting this book together. It's still kind of in process, I believe, but it's available online, so you can check it out, and he pretty much goes into everything you'd ever want to know and more about ES6. So if you really want to get into it, check that out. Okay, any questions about that before I move on? How many people are using ES6? A couple of people. On server side or client side?
Client, Ember.
Ember, client. Cool. Yeah, TypeScript. One of the things, if you do server-side JavaScript development, like Node.js, for example, that's actually a really good use case because then at that point, you're not even concerned about browser support. So, number one, if you use a current version of Node, by default, if you're using a current version of the V8 JavaScript engine, then you actually get some of those features anyway, depending on, at any given point, depending on where V8 is in their support of ES6, you get some of that. But then, because it's JavaScript, you can either use Babel and that type of thing to do the same strategy of transpiling your code, or you can actually use polyfill code directly in your code base on the server side, depending on what you want to do. So you actually have a lot of flexibility on the server side to take advantage of that syntax. So WebAssembly. How many people are familiar or have heard this term, WebAssembly? Okay, a few, not too many. It's been in the news really just the last few weeks, but it's actually a pretty interesting and important topic. So if you've been around web development for very long, you're probably familiar with some of these technologies, right? We've been essentially trying to target the web as not only for what it is as the web platform, but we've been trying to target it really as a binary runtime option as well for at least 20 years, if not longer. Java applets were introduced actually in '95, I believe, 20 years ago. ActiveX was, of course, Microsoft's technology for that. Flash, of course, from Adobe, and various others. Flash has obviously stuck around for certain use cases like video and games, but in terms of being, a general purpose development platform, their route for that was actually like ActionScript and Flex, and that stuff didn't take off and actually ended up getting killed. ActiveX, obviously, we all know is a dead-end technology, and Java applets really never did take off. And they all had various issues: security, performance, difficulty, not only developing, but as binary formats, you couldn't really debug them. In terms of like ActiveX, they were kind of unsafe. A lot of security issues in the browser. And so recently, in the last few years, there have been efforts to revisit those problems and try to solve them using more modern approaches. So NACL, PNACL, sometimes, not so much now, but you may have in the past heard it referred to as SALT, NaCl, sodium chloride, so they kind of gave it a nickname of SALT, and then portable native client. So these came out of Google, and these you can almost kind of think of as ActiveX in a way in terms of the strategy that they use, because it's all about compiling old school, unsafe code to be able to be executable in a browser. However, they do some tricks to keep it safe, much safer than ActiveX. So the code is sandboxed in a way that it's impossible for the code to do anything outside of its own little sandbox. Another thing, as far as performance goes, like with Java applets, for example, Java in a browser always runs in a JVM, right, a virtual machine. And so the Java code itself for the applets actually gets sort of compiled on the fly when it's run, and that allows it to run cross-platform, which is good, but that's why performance was historically a big issue with Java applets. And that's what JIT, just-in-time compilation, means. So in this case, compilation is AOT, ahead of time, so that avoids the performance penalty that Java applets, for example, had in the past. So this is actually, and I skipped over the P NaCl. So NaCl actually generates an executable, and for each platform that you want to run that code on, you have to have a different executable. And so that's actually kind of a drag, because then you kind of run into the same issues that we've had in the past of like, it's really hard to deploy and support that strategy. So that's why they came up with PNACL, which is the portable version of that strategy. And in that case, they're not producing the actual executable, they're producing the intermediate form of that, again, similar to a Java applet. And then it gets compiled by the browser, but it's still compiled ahead of time, which is kind of cool. So it's like the browser basically has a built-in compiler as opposed to having a VM type thing like the old school Java applets. So while that's good and it has some advantages, the bad thing is that obviously that's relying on browsers to implement a compiler for that type of code, and right now that's only Chrome. And in fact, Mozilla has basically come out and said that they don't support that strategy. So, I think where this stands today is it's probably never going to be a general purpose strategy for doing code on the web. But, if you're targeting specifically like the Google Play Store or something like that, or if you're building Google Chrome extensions, this might be a model that makes sense. So Mozilla's strategy is a little different. They're coming at the same problem, but from a totally different angle. So they approached it as, let's stick with JavaScript. JavaScript is already the foundational kind of runtime, if you will, of the web platform. So let's stick with it, but let's remove all the things that make JavaScript unsuitable as kind of a high-performance binary format. So things like sandboxing of certain data types, memory management and garbage collection and things like that. There's a list of things that are good for us as developers, but bad for writing really high-performant code, right? So think of all the things that we sort of lost from C when we went to JavaScript. So how can we, or this is their thinking, right? How can we create a subset of JavaScript that gets us back closer to C, essentially, right? So removing garbage collection, memory management, some of those other things. And it's kind of interesting, because it's a subset of JavaScript, ASM code can actually run on any browser. The difference is it won't be optimized on every browser, but it actually is executable on every browser. It's just JavaScript. So as you can see, that's a very different strategy than the strictly exe binary-based strategy that Google is pushing with NaCl. So it's the same concept of compiling. In their case, they have these tools in Scriptin, or there's a third-party tool, Mandrill. But again, it's the same concept. You're basically just taking C code, C++ code, whatever, and you're compiling it down to this subset of JavaScript. So in Firefox, as you would expect, coming from Mozilla, they actually have built into Firefox the optimized engine that actually can take ASM code and run it at near native speed. Chrome and Edge aren't as optimized, but they do actually support it. And then in other browsers, it will still run. It just won't be optimized. So the downside is it's slower, it's the same trade-off that you can imagine, right? It's just JavaScript, even though it's a very fast version of JavaScript, but it's still going to be slower than a true binary executable. However, it is much faster than vanilla JS. And it has some of the advantages like the security model in JS. You don't have to worry about that stuff, right? Because we've already, all the things like security that in the past were concerns, that's all been figured out with JavaScript. So with NaCl, they're sort of having to address those issues because they're coming at it with a new technology. But with ASM, that's a non-issue because it's just JavaScript. So that brings us to the current news of the day, which is WebAssembly. So Brendan Ike made an announcement about it. So if you're at all interested in this, you should actually read his announcement. Again, he's the guy who invented JavaScript. So a pretty good source to listen to on this. And it's basically, as he put it, a new intermediate representation for safe code, not just any code. It's also called WASM. It's kind of a play on, if you are an old school developer, you'll remember ASM, assembly code from the old days. So it is definitely a play on that. It's being kind of co-developed by all of the players that you would care about, so that's good. And it essentially is the same thing as ASM, but it's just delivered in a binary format, so it's more highly optimized than just JavaScript code. It actually is a binary format. The key is it can be decoded much faster, and they've done, the key use case that they talk about is on mobile. So when you load a big JavaScript application on mobile, a huge amount of the time that's spent, depending on the application, is in literally just parsing the JavaScript code, like parsing the text and making it executable. So as a binary format, there's no parsing, it's literally just loaded into memory and run, so it's much more efficient from that perspective, being a binary format. And this really is a big deal, even though, if you're not keeping up with this stuff, you may think that's not that big of a deal. It's not that important. And today that's kind of true, but it really is going to be a pretty big deal sooner than you might think. So this really solves a lot of the issues that I've talked about that we've had in the past in terms of trying to achieve this goal of being able to run binary code on the web. So it truly is cross-platform, but it truly also is native binary code. So it kind of combines the best of both ASM and NACL in that respect. It's also backed by all the major vendors, and they have a W3C community group dedicated to this. That is a big deal, because every other solution we've had up until now has all been vendor specific. So to finally get to the point technology like this where everyone has kind of bought into the same idea and they're all moving forward together is actually a really big deal. It's also a better compile target, and what that means is, with, say for example, with ASM today, which is JavaScript, when you want to compile C code and output it to ASM so it can run in the browser, and in fact with ES6, there are certain methods that they added in ES6 just to support that use case. So for example, they added a handful of math functions related to how you construct integers that you and I would never use or have any use for. And they literally only exist for compilers to be able to optimize integer transformations. But now, because that was required, that's now part of the JavaScript spec. So we have these functions that we don't care about in the spec of the language that we use, right? So the whole idea with WebAssembly as a different format is that it can actually replace JavaScript as the target for compilers, right? So if compilers are targeting WebAssembly and they decide, hey, we need these new math functions to do crazy stuff, that's great. Add those to WebAssembly, no problem. Basically leave JavaScript alone and let them kind of coexist and be on separate tracks. But that's what that means, basically. So JavaScript can continue doing what it does best, and WebAssembly can sort of take on that path of being the compile target. The source will be human readable, which is cool. It'll actually be, it hasn't been fully defined yet. They're in the process of doing that. But it looks like it'll be very similar to the current ASM code. And if you look at that code, there's some weird syntactical stuff in it, but it is still just JavaScript, and it is very readable and very debuggable. And in fact, it'll be hand-writable, which is very interesting as far as the binary format goes. Like I said, it's designed to coexist with JavaScript, and in fact, it'll even support calling methods to and from between JavaScript and WebAssembly binaries. So that's actually super cool if you think about it. That's like in the old days, that would be as if you could write a JavaScript script that called an ActiveX components method to do something and got a response, right? There are certain cases, depending on what you're doing, where that could be super useful, whether it's for performance or for video processing or a lot of different use cases. So if you're familiar with Node.js or kind of common JS syntax in general, where you can require a module, it literally will be conceptually just as easy as that. You literally just from your JavaScript code say require, whatever, module foo, and it could be some totally binary WebAssembly thing, but you can call into it, get a response, use it in your JavaScript. That's really cool. So I linked to this game. This is, if you're familiar with Unity, Unity is a platform that I don't think it's just games, but that's what most people use it for, game development. And so, hear that? So anyway, I'm not going to play it, but you can see, this is JavaScript code running in the browser. And the thing is, that in and of itself, hopefully I can balance, there we go. Okay, so that in and of itself is kind of cool, but it's not that cool because in actuality, there's lots of, there's solutions out there for that today. All the ones I mentioned earlier could actually do this. You can actually play this game as a Flash game and it works perfectly fine, right? So it's not cool just because it works well and it runs in the browser. It's cool because it does all those things and it has all these advantages, right? So, hello. So that's why it's so cool. It's essentially like saying you can write something that works as well and as nicely and at 60 frames per second as the best Flash app you can write, but it's in human readable JavaScript that performs at 60 frames a second. That is awesome. So that's what WebAssembly is all about. Like I said, it may not touch your life today, but I guarantee you, as the web platform continues to progress, that is going to become a much bigger deal. And I would hazard a guess that most of you, if you do any serious JavaScript development, even if you never write a WebAssembly component yourself, I bet at some point we'll all probably be using components like that and interacting with them in some way. So it's good to know about it. Any questions on that stuff? All right. Libraries and frameworks. So I'm not going to go through all these, but there were actually a few notable releases. These are all JavaScript frameworks, aside from Bootstrap, which is JavaScript and CSS framework that most of you have probably heard of. EXT.js, that's actually my old framework, so it's nice to see that still moving forward. Polymer is actually a very interesting one that we'll probably talk about a little bit more next month. Does anyone use Polymer? Has anyone played with that? So Polymer is Google's framework for doing web components. It's a very interesting library, and actually if you're interested at all in Google's new material design concept that they're pushing with all of their UI stuff, Polymer, basically part of what it does is it implements material design for the browser. And so you can go into all their elements and check them out. And so for example, like their input has these nice little UI interactions that I guess they're kind of maybe Android-ish or whatever, but it's actually very cool stuff. And the material design thing, whether you like Google or not, I think most people are giving them props about sort of taking a fresh approach to what the UX can look like in a web form, for example. And so it's definitely something to be familiar with, even if you're not planning on using it. But again, that's more on just the visual side. There's actually some really cool things that they're doing as far as how it's structurally built out of web components. And so, like I said, we may talk about that more next month. CooksDo is still kicking along. Has anyone ever used CooksDo? Has anyone ever heard of CooksDo? Raise your hand if you've heard of it. It's one of these frameworks. It's actually been around forever, and they've got like tons of releases, and I don't think anyone uses it. So I don't know who they're developing it for, but it's kind of an interesting, it's like a fully fledged framework for doing application and mobile development. Anyway, I was just curious if anyone used it. There's also something interesting that came out called JSON API. And it was just finalized, the 1.0 version of the specification was finalized just a few weeks ago. And so that's an interesting thing to look into if you do REST using JSON. So if you build REST APIs using JSON data, obviously it's fairly easy to do that, but this gives a really nice framework for standardizing how a lot of those interactions should work. And so, for example, if you're building a new JSON API, doing a simple call to get a single thing might be really simple, but then when you get into things like paging or parent-child relationships between resources or anything that starts to make the data non-trivial, then all those things are solvable, but it's up to you to kind of figure that out. This is all about giving you a standardized framework so that you don't have to reinvent those wheels, and it sort of tells you good, best practices way of doing that. So something to check out if you work with JSON and or REST. Quick mobile framework update. So Ionic, has anyone worked with Ionic? One person? So if you do anything on mobile, Ionic is a cool one to look at. It's a free MIT framework that does basically mobile, cross-platform mobile app components. They build on Angular, so that's a choice that may or may not be good for some people, but it works for them.
It's optional.
It's awesome, says Ted.
Oh, it's optional.
Oh, optional, not awesome.
Angular's optional.
Oh, okay, Angular's optional, gotcha. But if you do use Angular, it does have hooks that are optimized, I believe, to work with Angular. And obviously, syntactically, you'll probably like it if you like Angular. They did release version 1.0, which is part of why I'm mentioning it. They've been around for a while, but they've been working up to this 1.0 release. And the name of the release, Uranium Unicorn, just really loved that, so I wanted an excuse to say that. They're also working on this platform to do all the things you would expect nowadays for a mobile platform to support: push notifications, deploy analytics. There's also a framework called NativeScript that also just recently had a version 1, and actually a version 1.1 last week. This is by a company called Telerik, which has been around forever. If you're in the .NET world, for example, you've probably heard of them. They started out as a Microsoft-specific component shop, but they've kind of gotten into all the modern stuff as everyone else has. And it's actually very similar to Ionic. I would say it's more kind of enterprisey, as you might, what you typically think of, right? It's got a lot of components and it works decently, but it's also very expensive. But it's, if you're looking for a platform, that's one to look at. And then this is more of a micro library, but it just came out recently, and I thought it was kind of interesting. So if you have any needs for doing really fluid swipe type interactions, which has always historically been a tricky thing to pull off on mobile if you're doing non-native development. So this is JavaScript based. This works really well. So it supports all kinds of cool features like parallax, transitions, lazy loading, and a bunch of other stuff. But again, it's a micro library. It's specifically just for that type of interaction, but if you have the need for that, you should check it out. And now I have this section of my presentation where I usually just kind of talk about something that doesn't fit in any of those other buckets. Unicode. I know that's something we probably all are just dying to know what's going on with Unicode, right? So Unicode is actually a standard that continues to evolve, even though most of us don't probably care that much about it at this point. But they just released version 8.0, which I thought was kind of interesting. So lots of stuff with foreign language support, which is kind of an ongoing, never-ending thing. 86 Cherokee syllables, which I thought was interesting. But most importantly of all, we have lots of new emoji to play with. So a couple that I thought were interesting is any UT fellow Longhorns? We have an emoji just for us now called Sign of the Horns. That is awesome. I don't know if they did that just for us, but it's in there, so that's awesome. And then the other thing is, how often are you texting your significant other or whoever, and you just thought to yourself, man, if I only had a really sort of succinct way of expressing cheese wedge. I really need that. Now you have it, so that's awesome. Burrito, taco. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. This is actually a minor feature of it, but it is one that jumped out at me as being very interesting, is that the human emoji now support skin tone modifiers. And so when you think about it, that's pretty overdue, right? I mean, Unicode's been around for a long time. Emojis are relatively new, I guess, but they've been around for a while. And up until now, it's always been like generic little yellow faces or whatever, look like happy faces. But you can actually now express realistic kind of human skin tones through Unicode. That's kind of cool. And I also saw, again, in the spirit of introducing you guys to new things that you may not have heard about before, It's based on the 6 tones of the Fitzpatrick scale. And so of course I thought, what is that all about? And you can actually go and look, and it's this scale that they've come up with for, categorizing skin tone, basically. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. I would never have guessed that it was quite that sort of, figured out and scientific, but there you go. These icons are actually from OS X, so it is implemented on some platforms already, but it was just officially kind of standardized just in the last few weeks. Upcoming events. So there's a cool JavaScript conference coming to town next month. Unfortunately, the main part of the conference is sold out, although if you missed it and you're interested, you might watch their Twitter handle, because sometimes things open up. They do have a Node.js workshop that is still available, so if you're interested in learning Node, you might check that out. And I will be there, so if any of you will be there, let me know and we'll meet up there. I didn't see any other interesting events coming up in the next few weeks. Does anyone know of anything else? Cool. That's it for my section. I forgot at the beginning, normally at the beginning, I ask if anyone has any announcements. I forgot that earlier, but we can do that now. And that's typically if anyone is either looking for people, like if you have a job opening, or if you're a developer looking for a job, or any kind of announcement, if you have an event that you want to talk about. So I don't personally, I'm not looking for anyone, but I know of a company who's actually looking for EXT.js developers. So if anyone is that or knows someone, then let me know. Does anyone have anything that they would like to ask or announce? Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm from Africa, Central Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm here for a Mandela Washington Fellowship, which is the flagship of the US government, and I'm at the University of Texas at Austin. So I live at Dobby. Eddy, who's right here, is one of the mentors. He's been mentoring one of my fellow. So he introduced me last was it?
It's Monday.
Monday? Yes, Monday, to a Meetup group. So I found out this application and then I downloaded it. So I saw this meeting was coming up and I was like, okay, it's good for me to join. And then, because I'm an IT technician back in Africa, we have some project that we are doing down there. And as you can only imagine, the gap in between US and Africa in terms of technology is very big. So you guys are like here, and we are like here. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here, so I can meet some guys and some new techs. I know all of you are very interested in technology field, so it's something that's passionates me. So that's why I came here, and then I can get to know some of the guys and then meet some of our network, and then get to know some of the things that you guys are doing here. One of the things that we don't have in Africa is this kind of meeting. We don't have that. It's very rare to find people in Africa sitting like this and then talking about technology. And this is really inspiring me, and I think I'll take that back home, and when I go back home, I'll start initiating some kind of meeting where we can come up together and then discuss about some issue in the technology field. And one of the things that I would like also to improve while I'm here is my communication skills. I'm not really good at that. I'm coming from a French-speaking country, so it's very hard for me to be fluent in English, so you can bear with me. And I hope by the end of 6 weeks, which is the end of the program that we are following here at the university, I'll be able to speak fluently and maybe to stand up in front of 1,000 people and then make a speech. Okay, and thank you guys. That's all I wanted to do and to introduce myself.
Well, thank you.
Okay, wow. Anyone want to follow that? That was awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate that. Anyone else have any other announcements before we jump into the lightning talks? No? All right, I'll let, I was gonna say Ted, but actually Eddy's gonna use my computer, so I'm gonna let him go first since we're set up. Eddy has a project he's working on that he's going to demo for us. I don't know why it does this. Here we go. All right, take it away.
Thank you. My name is Eddy Reyes. I'm working on a startup called Tasqr, and Tasqr is meant for teams of developers or anybody who's making software to ship faster and do it much more easily. And no, I don't want to edit the slide. I want to go to the next slide. Sorry. Present. There we go. Sorry about that. So as everybody knows, in the last few years, software is eating the world, and you can use software now on your phone to get taxis, and I met a guy who uses he's building cloud platforms for farmers, writing John Deere tractors, and this is just pervading our lives everywhere, and cloud technology in many respects, along with other things, has made this possible. Hardware, like in the bad old days, is no longer a barrier to entry, and creating servers now is as easy as writing code. But of course, code has consequences, right? I'm trying to get that thing to go away. There we go. So I'm sure you've all heard of continuous integration. Continuous integration is a great process. In my experience, what ends up happening a lot is, I like to think of it as continuous inefficiency. You have developers working on a bunch of code. Everybody's very busy working on products. Creating data models, UIs, etc. And then I've been a developer for a while, and I always end up having to interact with the tester, the build guy, the DevOps guy, and essentially they run very different technology stacks a lot of times. And the whole point of DevOps is to bring the developers and the operations guys together so that they can work together more easily. But what I keep finding is that there's kind of this chasm. I still feel like I'm in a silo, even though that's what DevOps is trying to destroy, because everybody has a different technology stack. And what always ends up happening is the tester and the ops guy ends up just sort of sitting over my shoulder and watching my commands, and they just kind of like write it down or take it to their script, and or put it in their chef recipe or things like that. And we don't sort of use the same languages and the same technologies and the same methodology. So this inefficiency ends up being costly in many companies and many projects. People end up with tribal knowledge on one side. You have these very highly specialized skill sets that are hard to find, very expensive to hire. And then on the other side, developers hack code and they're busy all the time and they throw it over the wall and they blame the ops guy, and everybody ends up blaming each other when things go wrong. At the heart of all this stuff, the common language that we end up effectively using, and the common language that all these technologies boil down to, are just shell commands and files. Basically, you can express any sort of configuration you want to do as a simple command in a simple file, and that's essentially what Tasqr tries to capture. Tasqr is a command line recorder and replay mechanism that connects to a cloud backend of its own, and lets you record basically your commands in your files, so that you can repeat, so you can capture configurations and easily share them across your team and easily replay them onto your servers. And you can achieve some pretty nifty automation that way. So the way you use Tasqr is, say I'm a developer and I'm sitting down at my desk and I need to have some repeatable way to do this. I just run these commands, prepend Tasqr with it, and they get recorded in the cloud service. And then there's a web console in which you can you can run automations and you can look at these things and you can edit them. And I'll show you what that looks like now. So basically, this is the Tasqr. There we go. There's the top. Oh wow. No. I'm a Linux user, so I don't know all the Mac hotkeys. basically, this is a recording that builds a Docker container. And I recorded this by prepending all of these commands with Tasqr. And they basically get recorded here. If I were to go onto my system and edit this, this would all change real time. And this is a recording that shows you how to deploy a Flask application, a particular one that I have on my GitHub. And basically, you know, this is kind of like my compendium of recordings. This is actually a PowerShell recording. And if you look at this and you think about it, this is essentially an interactive Docker file. You know, Docker takes this approach as well. And Docker allows you to express configurations and commands in files. And it works out kind of nicely, and Docker solves a lot of problems, though this kind of decouples the concept of a Docker file from Docker itself. So basically, Tasqr has many, you know, there's many ways that you can replay this thing. You can do this on the command line, you can hook this up to your Jenkins, you can come in here and look at the servers that I manage, which basically has this one guy right now. And I can replay recordings. I can say, well, I want to replay, you know, like install Docker, start a, you know, build a Tasqr container. And I can also look at the history. Everything that I've ever run with Tasqr, it gets saved, and you have this audit trail with all your output and the times that it ran. And this stuff updates real time as well. And one of the things I set up here, I have this this repository right here. This has a very simple test program. It's a Flask application that demos PyTest, and I used this for a presentation on test-driven development that I gave a couple months ago. And this guy's hooked up to Tasqr, and I can edit this guy, this README right here. Let's edit him. And what this is going to do is this is going to take this entire Flask application, and he's going to deploy it in a Docker container on that control server that I just showed you, which is actually a server in Azure, which is Microsoft's cloud. So I'm going to come down here, I'm going to commit this guy to master, because we're crazy like that. And there you go. Now we're building a Tasqr container on this guy. And this is going to create a new server, which is a Docker container, which then asks Tasqr to provision itself with this Flask application. And when this guy finishes, he's, you know, sudo apt-get update. He's installing Tasqr onto the Docker container, which requires OpenSSL, so you can HTTPS out. When this finishes, you're going to see a new server pop up right here. Any questions about how that works? There he goes. That's my Flask application. There's a few features coming down the pipe for Tasqr. Basically, there we go. One of the things I'm working on is the Tasqr newsfeed. Tasqr has a very lightweight agent that runs on all your servers, and he can do things like tell you in a Slack channel every time something happens, like I just lost connectivity with one of your systems. He can send you an SMS when something, you know, you can basically configure it. It's going to be a generic webhook API. And the other thing I'm working on is the Tasqr hub, which for my customers is basically in my head right now. But how that works is, you know, basically leverage the community's recordings, copy them into your kind of workspace, modify them, and run them yourself. You know, so that you don't have to think up of how do I configure MongoDB. Somebody already did it out there, kind of like the Docker registry. It's in my head right now because I basically, you know, will do whatever the customer asks me to do right now. Rather than look it up into the Tasqr hub, they'll look it up in my brain. So, any questions? If you're interested, you can well, you can talk to me here. You can go to tasqr.io, or you can email me at eddy@tasqr.io if you want to try this out. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Eddy. Next is Ted. He's going to talk to us about a service that he's been building and some of the technology behind it. And I hope you're going to talk a little bit about the Kickstarter thing, or at least just mention it.
We'll mention it.
Has anyone here ever run a Kickstarter? So Ted just did that, so I'm kind of interested to hear a little bit about it.
Okay. Thanks. My name's Ted Patrick. I'm a co-founder at VestU. This is actually a partnership with myself and my father. My father's been doing investing for 35 plus years. He ran the endowment for the University of Texas for 11 years. And that experience, I don't know, we're trying to communicate the experience and knowledge of what he has experienced investing quite a lot of money with individual investors. And we went through the Kickstarter process, started 30 days ago. We did 12,000 in pre-sales and 100 pre-sale accounts. But we're going through building out courses, model portfolios, and tools to help individual investors become successful. The goal is basically a service that, for a small annual fee, allows you to make money yourself, do it yourself, without the investment services and other related fees. We basically show you what a realistic investment portfolio looks like, how it behaves long term, and how you can actually do really well. But that's not why I'm talking to you today. I'm here to talk to you about the tech. So my dad does the investments, I do all the technology. So one of the first problems we ran into was how do we actually get users logged into the service? And not only that, but actually begin to deploy applications and services on a regular basis. I've been working in JavaScript for a long time. And I was hesitant about using Node.js. But one of the things we kind of, in coming here, talking with some folks, Node.js, we tried it out, did some proofs, and kind of came up with a way of working with it. We went down a path of using a server that came out of Walmart Labs called hapijs. And I'm going to show you a happy code base that we wrote to do passwordless login. And passwordless login is fairly new. But the best way to think about it is it's like a password reset without a password. You're essentially using your email account, the account you use to basically log in and register with it. You're using it to log in. And you put in your email address, send you an email, and then you click on the link and you're logged in. It's kind of that simple. So I want to show you what that looks like with the service we built. So this is running at logintest.vestu.com. It's under HTTPS. And I'm just going to go submit this one in. Edge. And so I'm going to go through the registration process, okay? And we've sent you an email. And I check my email, and I've got a link. Hey, I registered. I clicked. I'm logged in. It's done. That's it. There's no password I ever have to remember. All I have to remember is my email address, and I know how to log back in. And login is exactly the same process as registration, actually. As awkward as that sounds, because you simply just send yourself an email, and there it is. In our particular case, you would have a payment process through the registration, and then your login is simply just using your email address to log in. So in building this out, a couple things. You had to write the server. There was no passwordless service that worked with Happy as a authentication login service. I had to kind of think through and go through all the security for how to do secure cookies encrypted on the server so that I can validate whether they've been tampered with, and then basically authenticate them when somebody comes back to the server, because you don't necessarily want to log somebody in again if they still have a token that is valid for that particular session. So how do you validate? But also, how do you just manage the data, and how do you do that in Node without putting a whole lot of burden on the server? So one of the things I did was I actually wrote the server and then I just open sourced it. So it's on GitHub under a VestU account. You can go take a look at all the code. It's there. It runs on AWS. It ties into AWS services. Part of this exercise is when you actually post the login mechanics of your server, it forces you through an audit that everyone should go through that process of actually posting the code that runs your business and posting it on GitHub, knowing that people can take a look at it. It forces you to move all of your security credentials outside of your code base, to have them in their environment and pull them in from the environmental variables. But the code base is very interesting because it covers a lot of ground in terms of how to write high-scale servers and also secure logins for in Happy and in Node. And so it kind of takes me back to talking about just Node.js in general. We've had a lot of luck with it, and a lot of luck with it in terms of how to use Happy to kind of make it work. And Happy has a really interesting philosophy about it, which is it's configuration driven. So when you're defining your servers, you're defining routes and behavior, you're configuring them, and then that behavior lives down those paths depending on who the user is and what they're doing. So you use npm to get Happy, npm init, and then npm install, that saves it locally. And then this is a complete web server. That's all the code there is. You require in Happy, you create a server instance out of the Happy library. You define a connection mechanism, which is what port is the server going to run in, or is it going to pull from the environmental variables that are passed in, say from AWS? And how are those going to run? And so in this case, I pull the environmental variable process.end.port, or I run on port 8000. And then you just define a server route. And the server route's fairly simple, but they're very declarative. So server.route, method, this is a get request. This is the root homepage, so slash. And then the handler is just a JavaScript function. And all I'm going to do is the behavior, the interface of the function is always request and reply, and then you just respond. You just say reply is some text, and you send it back. Has support for handlebars, has support for other templating models, so you can actually return, so you simply just pass a context, and then the template actually renders all the data. But the performance is really great, the caching model is really great. It does have support for gzipping, pre-gzipping all of the content on your server, which it's pretty rare to find. And it aligns really well with AWS and being able to simply just deploy to, we deploy on Elastic Beanstalk, but simply do a deployment and know that the application can automatically scale up or down depending on the number of people hitting it. And then to just run the server, you just run node.server. That's it. It's pretty straightforward, and you can build things pretty quickly. And I have that server here. So this is the code base for the server. It's the package.json that was there. And I have all the node modules installed for Happy and others. And that's through PM. And all I really have to do is just do node server, and we're running on port 8000. And so I can just say, done. That's it. And the performance of the server is actually really good. We took this one out and basically did some load testing on it, and the performance of Happy is really, really good. Because it's all non-blocking on Node, you're essentially able to send out large volumes of text through the server, even through images, without any hit. And on AWS, it runs as a child process under Nginx. So you actually get all of Nginx features networking-wise above the Node.js service. So you can actually access and configure things inside of Nginx and the like. But it was an interesting project. It was really kind of my first foray into Node, and the first time I've been dependent on a server, or from a server point of view. I'm used to using Python in that regard, but this has been kind of I'm happy. I like using JavaScript on the client side, but I've always been semi-terrified of doing it on the server side. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, and then Tiffany, are you still here?
Yeah, so I'm just really short.
Yeah, so Tiffany also volunteered. She's going to talk about RSpec, which is a Ruby, is it Rails specific or is it?
Yeah, it's Rails.
Yeah, so it's a Rails specific library for doing a specific style of testing. So you want to come up here, talk about it?
Sounds good.
Has anyone actually ever done BDD or TDD style development? Oh wow, quite a few people. How many of you have used RSpec specifically? So a few. Cool.
Yeah, I'm gonna try it without this. And
Well,
yeah.
actually, it helps with the live stream people.
Oh, okay.
You want to just kind of hold it down here?
Yeah, sorry guys, I'm super squeaky, so I know that's rough to hear at the end of the day. We're just gonna have to work through that, all right? So my name's Tiffany. This is my first time to be here. I decided the best way to fit in a tech like Meetup is to have a tiny jacked up piece of note card paper, right?
It works.
Yeah, okay. So RSpec is essentially a Rails testing framework. Right now, at least from my understanding, because I'm still fairly new to the market, it's one of the ones that's being used the most, simply because it's got a lot of things you can add to it. So roughly, can I see everyone's hands again? Who's used Rails/RSpec before? Okay, well, who likes code that isn't hella jacked later? Okay, I got a few. Some people like hella jacked code. That's fine too. All right, so this is why this talk can apply to everyone. Because essentially the goal of when you do any testing is so you can have better code in the future. You're essentially supposed to get rid of, let's say, 50% of future bugs. This is a little optimistic, but kind of true, if you do the testing right and optimize it first. Now, the first thing I think we gotta talk about first, before we really get into RSpec specifically, is what is TDD, what is BDD, what am I supposed to do with this? So if we go back to the mid to late 90s, that's when we first started to see the rise of TDD, which is test-driven development, right? And it's the idea that we should actually write all of our tests before we should create our code. That way, we don't have to worry about, hey, I wrote this, how much am I gonna have to change it later so it's actually working without bugs or without that no method error? I hate saying that, right? Like everything else within tech though, within a few years they thought, well, there's something I want to change with this. Because within the TDD environment, the problem that was starting to occur was that some people were focusing too much on the internal dynamics of testing rather than the external. What I mean by that is essentially they would be hard coding things like, hey, you need to have this output, but in an array. So if they changed it to a hash later, it just wouldn't work, even if the functionality of the program remained the same. There's still some discussions about TDD versus BDD. For the purpose of this mini lightning talk and in my super tiny understanding, I'm gonna say that they're offshoots of one another, right? Cool. So we've got a little background, have an idea, sort of what's up. Now I'm gonna talk about why RSpec is just kind of awesome and I love it a lot. So within Rails, we have different testing frameworks that we can use. Cucumber, mini-test, test unit, however you want to refer to it, capybaras sort of used sometimes with them, and RSpec. To me, RSpec, although most people don't start out with it because it's a little lengthier than, let's say, mini-test, unit test, which is what's already built into Rails, to me it's worthwhile to go ahead, take the extra effort, and find it, mainly because it reads a lot better. So this is when I wish that I had had the awesome presentation like they did earlier with the actual screen, but I'm just gonna sort of ad-lib this, right? Let's say that I wanna make a test with RSpec. It would essentially be set up description or describes bucket list. After that, it would say context, create a new bucket list, do, then we would have it creating it, and then what you would what's given and what you expect to get. So it's pretty easy. If you can just remember in my convolutedness, when, given, and then, right? That's literally the format that it takes. Versus mini tests where you always have to wonder about, oh, if I assert something, it's true. If I assert something, it's false. To me, after a while, if I stare at a screen long enough, that's harder for me to read than reading something that looks like something I would read in elementary school, and I can create the code to correspond with that. Cucumber, to me, is just awful because it deals with regular expression. Maybe y'all like that more than me. I hate regular expressions. Hate. Plus, the cool thing, at least for me, about RSpec is it also color codes things, and the troubleshooting's a little bit better because you can literally sometimes just copy and paste certain parts to correct it. Super, super nice. All right, so you're probably wondering, hey, so how do I actually run this? Is it super hard to get going? The answer is absolutely no. So given that some of y'all have Rails experience, sorry, this is probably super repetitive, but Rails is sort of like magic, but sort of not. Because we have these things called gems, which are essentially pre-compiled libraries that have all the stuff that I want that someone much smarter than me already built for me to jack, which is exactly what you do with RSpec, right? So you go ahead, you install it, get it going with your Rails app, and then put whatever RSpec test you want in there, and then just run RSpec, whatever the test is. At that point, it's up to you with organization. If you have smaller files, sure, you can put your test in the same ones as everything else, but after a while, you might want to put that into separate folders. So, in conclusion, RSpec's kind of awesome. It's really easy to use. If y'all look at a quick tutorial online, it would literally take y'all maybe 5 minutes to just get something up simple and running, and it's just a good idea to start integrating more tests within our codes. So yeah, RSpec.
So how many people who code actually write tests consistently? Or how many don't? At least, okay, a few honest people. Yeah, thanks for the talk. It's a super interesting topic to me too, because I've actually I enjoy the BDD syntax, which is basically, the B is behavioral, so it's behavioral driven syntax, and it basically just means that you describe your test just like Tiffany said. It's not assert X equals true. It's given the fact that X is this, then I expect it to be this, right? It's a more human readable, format. And the nice thing about that too is on the output side, if you have an error, the error actually reads nicely when you've structured it that way. So I'm a big fan of BDD. I've never used RSpec though. So thanks for that. Does anyone else have anything, have you been inspired by anything you heard tonight to get up and share anything, project you're working on, anything like that? It doesn't have to be anything fancy.
I got a real quick one.
Okay.
Thanks. My name is Brian, and you were talking about material design earlier, and I'm a huge fan of material design. There's actually a CSS library called Material CSS, which is like Bootstrap, but for material design specifically. It has like JavaScript bindings. It looks really, really cool. So you should check that out. Also, I want to plug a project I'm working on. I'm trying to build like a better job board for Austin programmers. So if you're looking for a job, you can go to my site. It's hirely.com, HIRILY.com.
Is it live right now?
It's live right now. So I spent a lot of time on the user interface trying to make it better to find jobs. So I created like a map view. So like if you live in South Austin, you don't want to find a programming job in North Austin because traffic would kill you. So that was a big pain point I tried to solve. And also I added a bunch of like filters and tags so you can like easily browse for like Ember.js jobs or Angular jobs. So yeah, check it out and let me know what you think. Yeah. No, it's I instead of E. Yeah, HIRILY.
You're not on the screen.
Yeah, and then if you click on
You're not on the screen.
Getting it set up. Looks material.
yeah.
Material designing. If I could get this thing to not do that every time I switch, I would be super happy. There we go.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I use that material design framework, which is really nice. And so I have like all these job categories right now. So like here we're looking at JavaScript jobs, and you can see like the different tags for like Node.js, Angular, whatnot. And you can switch over to the map view, which like shows all the jobs on a map. And then you can see like, oh, if I live in West Austin, I can see what this one is and check it out. So yeah, that's about it. Still working on some new features, but let me know if you have any feedback. Appreciate it.
Very cool.
Could you use that?
So you used material .css to build this. Is it paid or free, or what's the deal? What's the
It's
model?
free. I'm just trying to get like all the jobs under there right now. Like, there's not really a business model yet, but maybe there will be in the future. But right now, I'm just trying to get as many jobs
Well, if there's
as possible.
Gotcha. So if there's no business model, you should totally go after some VC funding. Then. That's the path for that, right? Sorry if any of you are VCs. Cool, man. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else have anything? Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks for coming out. A couple of us, at least, usually head over a block over to 6th Street to Buffalo Billiards to have a beer and talk about whatever is interesting to talk about. So if anyone is interested in doing that, feel free to head over there. Otherwise, thanks for coming out. And if you have any questions or want to tell me anything directly, I'll be hanging around here for a few minutes. Other than that, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. And thanks again to Docket Navigator. One last shout out for the pizza. Thanks, guys.